Three, two, one. Well, in memory assemblages, I looked into the transcendental issue. Oh, that was an interesting accident in the recording. Let's try to put it this way. Okay, so I was looking into the transcendental issue. In fact, the outer transcendental issue, as I call it there, to make it together, to place it together with the outer speculative, which for me was to go outer transcendental in the sense of asking sort of questions about the conditions of possibility for presence. And it goes together with the outer speculative, which is speculation beyond the assumptions of presence, and the outer metaphysics, which is departing from the usual assumptions of metaphysics. So, in a sense, there the transcendental appears as a way to present the panmnemism, because my spectral realism there, which is the idea that memory assemblages are ubiquitous, they are everywhere. This idea, it's an idea that is then appears as outer transcendental, outer metaphysical, and outer speculative. Outer transcendental in the sense that it offers an account of a transcendental account of what exists. So it sort of offers the conditions of possibility for both thinking and being. In the sense that thinking and being have a common structure, not that they are the same, but in a sense they interfere with each other because they have the same structure. Which is made of memory assemblages, which is made of the pair of retention and retrieval. Now, then memory assemblages are transcendental. And I've been thinking about ways to actually, look for transcendentality beyond the mnemic, beyond this commonalities, these dynamics of memory assemblages. And of course, I mean, one way of doing that is to consider concepts. Of course, concepts are ways of to think in terms of concepts is to place concept outside memory assemblage. Concept is something that once is retained, once is archived, stays like this and doesn't deserve any retention. It's not in the economy of the textual, for instance. A concept can be separated from the text. A concept is thought of something that once mobilized is mobilized as it is in every circumstance. So it's not dependent on context and therefore is not in the economy of the textual. So in a sense, concepts kind of stand alone. They are established once and for all. Perhaps they are badly established and you can correct them, but the idea is that ideally they will be once established once and for all. That is in a retention that doesn't require any retrieval. So it's there. And concepts are not dependent on text. They're not dependent on memory assemblages. They're not dependent on retrievals of archives because they, in a sense, are outside this dynamic, outside the text. If you're to put it in terms of text, concepts are genuinely presences that are conceived as something that don't depend on texts, and they don't depend on memory assemblages, they don't depend on retrieval, they don't depend on addends, they don't depend on addition, they depend only on the archive, on what retained them. So concepts are an example of this idea of this search, this quest for transcending, transcendental, transcending in the sense that something that transcends the mnemic, transcends the text. Here, I can kind of navigate between the two, but basically the idea is that whatever whatever is the dynamic of archiving or texts, all these dynamics that to me has to do with the diachronicity, but also has to do with the diacritical, that is the spaces between elements. So you've got the spaces between the elements and the time that is, in a sense, figured, but by these very spaces. So concepts is the traditional way to think. Well, if you think, for instance, traditionally you think of transcendental formula, things like, conceptual capacities, and there you go, concepts, or something like a set of categories that act as concepts established once and for all. And once the deduction of these categories are produced, you don't need any retention. Deduction is conceived in a classical way, in the sense that they're gone. Yeah, once it's there, it's there. So they're never gone. In a sense, they're not affected by anything else that you add to them. So new categories are going to be categories that are in the usual sense empirical. They're not going to be transcendental, but in a sense, the idea that categories are formed. Transcendental is a way to actually go towards that, towards having concepts as the transcendental. And then you can have like different ways of thinking of this. Like, for instance, you can think of ideal objects in the sense of Husserl, and you can place this very much on the side of transcendental, of conceptual, or transcendental, that is based on the conceptual. Now, okay, this is not very surprising, but then what I also think is that there are two other forms to actually conceive the transcendental as transcending, as outside the text, outside the archive, outside memory assemblages, as retentions that, in a sense, dispense retrievals. One of them is the trace itself. The trace itself, at least in some texts by Derrida, is presented as something that is kind of inter-reading. It doesn't. It doesn't depend on the reading. Therefore, it doesn't depend on the retrieval. It's something that is retained there. So basically, if you have a text, the trace is there. Trace is not going to be something that you're going to change depending on the reader, on the reading. So basically, it's a retention that doesn't require retrieval. Of course, it's not a content, it's not a conceptual thing that is retained. So it's different. It's a different kind of transcendental, of course. But at the same time, being a different type of transcendental, it's also transcending, because you've got this trace that is independent of the economy of the textual. So basically, is not something that articulates the text, but it's something that is there no matter how you retrieve the text. So in a sense, to me, this is an off text. The trace is a transcendental, which is all text. Therefore, transcending in that sense that I want to use. The third thing, of course, is whatever kind of offers the conditions of possibility for the trace. According to Malabou, you need to ask these questions, and she's going to find these things in forms. She's going to find these transcendental forms. Plasticity is going to be the transcendental in that sense. Maybe the outer transcendental. We're talking about outer transcendental in the case of traces as well, but that doesn't make it less transcending. So this transcendental of forms sort of gives the condition of possibility for traces, and I think this makes a lot of sense. But in a sense, it does that. It does that only to the extent that it's placed outside, of course, the economy of the text and outside the economy of whatever it interferes with. Call it like the empirical transformations, for lack of a better word, but basically they are going to be transcending in the sense that form, plasticity is outside the scope of what it affects. It sort of interferes in whatever it interferes in from outside as a kind of a general characteristics. It's not a concept of course. I mean, at least it's not taught as concepts, but they're not presences as well. Traces are not presences like concepts are, but at the same time they are there. Yeah, they are at the same time they are not. They're immune to whatever happens in the textual economy or among what is transformed. So in a sense, what memory assemblages offers can be placed, can be described, can be elaborated in terms of a transcendental. So it's a transcendental story which is outside. It's not under the suspicion of being transcending. It's not something that offers the conditions of possibility from outside, but as the very structure of the texture that makes things the way they are. So in a sense, it's an empirical transcendental. I don't think is the best way to put it, but in a sense, to use the classical words of the 20th century, it would be like this. It would be a transcendental that is not outside that scope, precisely because it doesn't transcend it. It comes from, it comes from the immanence of the mnemic, the immanence of memory assemblages. Of course, I mean, this is not my preferred word, but I think you can put it this way. So it contrasts both with concepts, of course, and it contrasts also with both with traces and forms. In that sense, that the contrast itself is in the book, but what I think is interesting to think now is that contrast can be thought through in terms of how we conceive the transcendental, and how can we do it without postulating it as having to be transcendent.